Welcome, everyone, to another unsettling journey into the shadows with today's feature, three disturbing true fall horror stories. Fall is a season that seems almost designed for unease. The air grows colder, the days shorter, and the nights feel impossibly long. Leaves whisper secrets as they scatter across empty streets. And the chill in the air seems to creep not just under your skin, but into your very soul. It's the perfect backdrop for stories that blur the line between the explainable and the deeply unsettling. Before we begin, I want to extend a heartfelt thank you to all of you for being here. Your continued support through your likes, comments, and shares keeps this channel alive and thriving. If you're new, welcome to our growing community of horror lovers. Be sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss any of our spine-tingling content. As always, I wish you good health, peace of mind, and a touch of courage as we venture together into the unknown. Let's step into the crisp, haunting embrace of fall and uncover the stories waiting to send chills down your spine. Stay close, because things are about to get unsettling. Story 1: The Last Pickup. When I returned to the apartment that evening, I didn't feel at home. No, the space I had once thought of as a refuge now felt alien, unwelcoming, a hollow shell where I was the intruder. The silence that had seemed so comforting before now clung to the air like a thick fog, pressing down on me with a weight I couldn't escape. The walls seemed to draw inward, contracting with an unnatural rhythm, as though the place itself were breathing. I tried to dismiss the unease creeping up my spine, rationalizing it as a result of the bizarre encounter at Cody's house. He had seemed wrong, certainly. But people are strange sometimes, aren't they? We all have our quirks, our oddities. I could handle it. I should have handled it. But every creak, every snap of the floorboards beneath my feet seemed to echo through the apartment, a low, constant hum that was too familiar, too insistent. I found myself standing still in the middle of the room, staring at nothing, as if waiting for something to manifest. A sound, movement, but there was nothing. I tried to go about my evening, pacing through my familiar rituals, putting the kettle on, setting the small table for one, as though nothing had changed. But as I stood there waiting for the water to boil, I caught a glimpse of myself in the reflection of the window. The shadows had lengthened, and the dimming light distorted my image, twisting it into something unfamiliar. For a moment I thought I saw something standing behind me, tall and unmoving, like a specter at the edge of my vision. I turned quickly, but there was nothing, just the quiet of the apartment, the soft hum of the refrigerator. I didn't want to admit it, but I felt like I was being watched. It wasn't a paranoia that was easily dismissed, it was something deeper, something far older. It was as though the very air in this place was charged with a silent presence that was waiting, patient and unrelenting. I wasn't alone here. Not really. I hadn't been alone since the moment I stepped into Cody's house. That night, as I lay in bed, I could feel it again, the weight of something pressing against my chest, pulling the air from my lungs. I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw at the house, Cody, the decorations, in that damn tub. I saw them all more clearly now, the wrongness of them emerging in sharper focus. The plastic leaves, their brittle edges curling as if decaying even as I looked at them. The scarecrows with their twisted expressions, faces frozen in permanent grimaces. It was as if they had all been waiting for me, not just to purchase them, but to take them home, to bring them into this place, this fragile shell I had called home. And then came the dreams. The first one was fleeting, a blur of shapes and figures. But there was one constant in it, the sensation of being watched, the unnerving realization that I was not alone, even in my sleep. In the dream, I stood in that same room, surrounded by those same decorations. But the decorations weren't as they appeared before. They were alive. Their faces were not painted smiles, but twisted, gnashing mouths, silently screaming. Their eyes, black and empty, followed my every movement. And somewhere, in the distance, Cody's voice called to me low and gravelly, like an echo from some forgotten place. I awoke with a start, my heart pounding in my chest. The dream lingered, its oppressive atmosphere clinging to the room. I was drenched in sweat, my sheets twisted around me as if I had been thrashing in my sleep. But there was something I couldn't explain. The smell of the apartment had changed. It was heavier now, thick and stale, like the air in a place long abandoned. The familiar scent of dust and wood had turned rancid, as if something had died here. Something old. Something that had been waiting for me. The next day, I tried to go about my life as if nothing had happened. I met Sally for coffee, tried to laugh it off, but I couldn't ignore the growing sense of unease that gnawed at me. My reflection in the shop window seemed distorted, as though the world itself was beginning to warp around me. The faces of people on the street seemed more hollow, their movements mechanical, like puppets whose strings had been pulled too tightly. When I returned home that evening, I did the only thing that seemed logical. I checked the tub. I had to see them again, the decorations, to prove to myself that they were just objects, just things I had bought. I had to reassure myself that there was nothing wrong with them. The tub sat exactly where I had left it, the decorations haphazardly scattered inside, as if tossed carelessly aside. But when I reached in to touch them, I felt something that made my skin crawl. The leaves were cold, unnaturally so, like they had been frozen. And the scarecrow I touched, it wasn't just cold. It was wet, slick as though something alive had coated it in a thin layer of something viscous. My fingers recoiled instinctively, but my mind, fogged with a sense of disbelief, urged me to touch it again. I pulled the scarecrow from the tub, my breath shallow in my throat. There was a sound, a low scraping like nails on glass. And then I saw it, something that had been hidden beneath the fabric, twisted and unnatural. The face. It wasn't painted. It was real flesh and bone, but decayed, blackened, and bloated. The eyes were hollow, the skin slack and stretched tight across the skull. I dropped it immediately, backing away, but the image remained in my mind, burned into my vision. I couldn't escape it. I threw the decorations out, discarded them in the trash outside. But that night, when the shadows lengthened and the air grew thick with an oppressive weight, it was too late. The presence that had followed me since that house had arrived. There was no turning back now. The next morning, the decorations were back. They were in the same tub, as though nothing had happened. The scarecrow, the leaves, the twisted, decayed face, all of it was back, waiting. And as I reached for the tub again, I heard the voice. Waiting. Always waiting. This time I couldn't deny it. It wasn't just my imagination, not some trick of the mind. This was something real, something that had been waiting for me for us for a long time. I never returned to Cody's house. But that night, as I lay in bed, trying to shut my eyes to the nightmares, I heard it again. The sound of the door slowly, silently creaking open. And in the darkness, I felt them there behind me, beside me, waiting. There's no escaping them. They were never just decorations. They were waiting for someone to take them home. And now I was the one who was being watched. And I would never be free. Story 2: The Stranger in the Mist. In the autumn of 2019, I left the sterile confines of university life behind and moved to Asheville, North Carolina. I had been searching for something, perhaps peace, perhaps distance from the clamorous world of academia, and I found it, or so I thought, in the mist-clad mountains that cradled the town. The air in Asheville was dense with fog, and I often found myself walking through it, losing myself in the damp, rolling white that softened the world into something distant, uncertain. The mist was like a veil, shroud that obscured not just the landscape, but the very fabric of my thoughts. It was in this suffocating uncertainty that I thought I would find solace, or at the very least solitude. I was 22 and wandering, alone as one does when burdened by the quiet realization that life, especially my own life, was slipping away unnoticed, unmarked. In this place where the air had weight and the mountains stretched like jagged teeth against a gray sky, I thought I might finally shed the skin of youth's pretensions. The city had been so loud, so full of triviality. Here, in the wilderness, I would be free. But I had no idea how the land would make me feel freer than I had ever imagined, nor how it would unravel the tenuous threads of my understanding. I spent my days walking on trails that wound deeper into the ancient forests, up paths that stretched into the folds of the mountains. The trees here were unlike the ones I had known growing up. They were older, twisted in ways that suggested they were not just living organisms, but sentinels, silent watchers of time and decay. I would lose myself in them, allow the sounds of leaves crunching beneath my feet to dull the other noises in my mind. And yet, there was something unsettling in this quiet, as if the trees themselves were breathing slow, deliberate inhales that echoed in my bones. I found a peculiar solace in these woods, a certain resignation that came from standing still for long stretches of time, watching the fog crawl over the land like a living thing. But it was never quiet in the way I imagined it should be. The air held a weight, an unspoken burden that seemed to settle on the shoulders of everything. And always, the mist hung just a little too thickly, just a little too close to the earth, as though trying to suffocate the very breath of the forest. It was on one of those days that I ventured into DuPont State Forest. The air was thick with the kind of humidity that sinks deep into your bones, and the mist had taken on a strange, almost tangible quality. The water of Triple Falls churned and foamed ahead, but the sound seemed muted in the distance, as if the mist had swallowed it whole. It was then that I saw her. She was standing just off the trail, obscured partially by a cluster of trees, her figure blending into the fog as if she too were part of the landscape. At first, I thought she was just another hiker, someone lost or waiting for the right moment to move on. But something about her was off. Her hair was a strange, brittle gray blonde, hanging in strands that seemed as though they had not seen sunlight in years. Her clothes were dark, out of place in the vibrant autumn foliage, and her skin, a pale, almost translucent white, seemed to gleam against the mist. I raised my hand, a reflexive greeting, but she did not respond. There was no acknowledgement, no movement beyond her stillness. She simply stood, her gaze fixed upon me, her expression unreadable. It wasn't just the silence that unnerved me. It was the stillness. She wasn't just standing still. She was waiting. I couldn't place it, but the sensation was suffocating. There was something profoundly wrong in her presence, something in the way she stood, too quiet, too motionless for a living person. For a moment, I considered walking past, pretending I hadn't seen her, but my feet wouldn't move. It was as though the world had come to a halt, as though I were standing on the precipice of something I couldn't see. It was then that I felt it, the weight of her gaze, not just on my body, but within me. It was as though she were looking directly into my thoughts, reading the hidden recesses of my mind, as though I was no longer merely a man passing through the woods, but a specimen under inspection. And then, without a sound, without a single shift in the air, she turned. Slowly, deliberately. Her movement was not human, not in the way we are accustomed to seeing people move. It was unnatural, like a puppeteer pulling invisible strings. She began walking into the mist, disappearing into it, leaving behind nothing but the soft whisper of her departure. I stood for a moment, my heart pounding in my chest, trying to make sense of the encounter. But the woods were silent again, the world returning to its strange equilibrium, and I convinced myself that I had imagined it, that she was simply another lost traveler, perhaps some eccentric old woman out for a walk. But as I moved forward, something in the air had shifted. The mist had deepened, grown thicker, and a suffocating unease had settled over me. The trail ahead of me seemed to close in, as if the trees themselves were drawing together. The weight of the forest, of the mountains, pressed in on me, a constant reminder that I was not as alone as I thought. I tried to shake off the feeling, but it clung to me, settling beneath my skin like an itch I couldn't scratch. By the time I reached High Falls, the fog had descended so thickly that I could barely see a few feet ahead. The sound of the waterfall had become muffled, as though the mist itself were swallowing it. That's when I saw her again. She was standing there as if waiting, just on the other side of the falls. Her form was hazy, like a shadow that refused to be defined. I froze. It was her. But this time she wasn't just watching, she was waiting for me. There was a dreadful awareness in her eyes, something I couldn't comprehend. Her lips were parted as though she wanted to speak, but not in words. There was no voice, only a feeling of vibration that resonated deep within me. A scream built in my chest, but I couldn't release it. My legs refused to move. It wasn't fear, not the kind I knew. No. This was something deeper. This was a creeping recognition of something that had been gnawing at me for days, weeks even, something I couldn't fully understand, but felt in my bones, in the marrow of my existence. And then, just as before, she turned. Slowly, deliberately, her form fading into the mist, melting into the forest as though she were never there. The moment stretched, elongated like a broken piece of time, and I could feel it, the feeling of being left behind, abandoned to an eternal waiting. I turned and ran, or at least I thought I did. The path ahead twisted in impossible ways, the ground beneath my feet shifting like water. But no matter how fast I moved, the air remained thick, suffocating, the mist creeping into my lungs. I was lost, hopelessly lost, and the feeling of her presence, her eyes, followed me like a shadow I could not outrun. I didn't stop running until I reached the covered bridge at the edge of the forest. The fog was thick there too, clinging to the wooden beams like old memories, but I could no longer feel the weight of her gaze. She was gone. At least I thought she was. I left the forest that day, but the world had changed. My perception of it, at least. I no longer trusted the boundaries of reality. The woods, once a place of quiet reflection, now felt like a trap, an endless cycle of time folding in on itself. And everywhere I went, I felt her. Her eyes, her presence were there, lurking just beyond the edges of my vision, waiting for me to acknowledge them. The days that followed were a blur. I couldn't shake the sense that something had followed me home, that she had never really left. She lingered in the corners of my apartment, in the shadows of every doorway, watching. I tried to tell myself it was paranoia, but there was a deeper truth gnawing at me. It was as if the fabric of my life had been torn, and through that tear, she had slipped in an old memory, a forgotten ghost, now woven into my very being. It was weeks before I received the call. My aunt, a distant relative, had died. The funeral was a formality, a ritual I had long since detached from, but something about her struck me with an inescapable clarity. My aunt had lived on the outskirts of Asheville, in a small cabin near the woods. I had never known her, never thought to ask about her life. But when I saw the photograph of her, it was undeniable. The same grayish blonde hair, the same pale, hollow eyes. The woman in the mist. I thought I had escaped, that I had outrun whatever had followed me from the woods. But I hadn't. She was waiting. And now I realized she always had been. Waiting for me to see her, waiting for me to understand. The question now is not whether I will escape, but whether there is anything left to escape from. Story 3 Shadows in the House. The air thickened in Brunswick, Georgia, as October's chill seeped into the bones of the city. The leaves, once a riot of color, had crumbled into ash, as if the very earth was losing its vitality. Halloween loomed. It was a time when the borders between the tangible and the intangible grew porous, when darkness seemed to gather in the corners of every street and crevice. There were rumors that the air itself tasted different during this season, darker, richer, as though it carried the weight of unspoken things. Carlos and I had spent our childhoods planning pranks, weaving mischief in the half-light of the dying day. But nothing at all, compared to the anticipation of tonight. We had heard of the Parker house, a relic of a forgotten time, abandoned for decades. It had become the stuff of whispered legend, an epitome of decay and dread. Its windows, like hollow eyes, stared vacantly at the world, and its facade, peeling and warped, seemed to pulse with a life of its own, as though it were a thing living and waiting. We approached the house just after dusk, the evening's haze curling around us like a fog. The dim light of our flashlights cut into the darkening world in thin, sickly beams. The house stood at the end of a street long abandoned, its isolation adding a weight to the air that was palpable, suffocating. I felt it then, a creeping unease, not from fear, but from a deep instinctual awareness of how fragile and fleeting our presence here truly was. "Tonight's the night," I whispered to Carlos. My voice was a thin thread in the thickening silence. Carlos grinned, though it felt forced, as if the grin itself was a hollow thing. He had a baseball bat clutched in his hand, and I had one too. The cold metal of the bat in my palm was a meager reassurance, a talisman against the unknown. The smell of beer in my backpack mixed with the damp earth beneath our feet, and I felt reckless, intoxicated on something other than alcohol. The back door opened without a sound, as though the house itself had invited us in. A stale breath of air greeted us, thick with the scent of mildew, dust, and something sharp, faintly metallic. I stepped inside first, the floorboards groaning beneath my weight as if the house were acknowledging my presence, resenting it. I didn't like the groan of the floorboards. It felt wrong, too deliberate, like a warning given too late. Carlos darted up the narrow staircase before I could follow. His silhouette seemed to vanish into the shadows, swallowed by the house as though it had never existed. I hesitated, unease crawling up my spine. The darkness pressed in, tightening around me. I lingered, and my flashlight flickered as I turned it toward the room to my left. The faint light illuminated the room in a dull, sickly glow, revealing faded wallpaper adorned with childish drawings. The innocence of the art-silly scribbles of stick figures and houses struck me as grotesque in the face of such decay. The juxtaposition made my stomach turn. It was as though innocence had been scrawled on the bones of a forgotten corpse. I tried to shake the feeling, but something in the room kept me rooted to the spot. I needed to find Carlos. I pushed through the detritus of the room, my mind racing for reasons to explain away the growing dread. But none came. There was only the weight of silence, thick and stifling, and the peculiar feeling that I was being watched. The air seemed to hum with it. The staircase was narrow, spiraling upward as if the house itself were curling inward, folding in on itself. Shadows stretched long across the walls, too long. I could feel them, stretching, crawling with a kind of sentience. The familiar creaks beneath my feet became deafening in the silence. The second floor felt different, unfamiliar, alien. The very atmosphere seemed to thicken, as though the walls themselves were breathing. They were closing in, inch by inch. I found Carlos standing at the end of a long hallway, his back to me. His laughter floated through the corridor, light, mocking, as though he were amused by something that wasn't quite there. But it felt wrong. It felt too light, too out of place. Like a laugh from a nightmare, heard but not truly understood. "Carlos," my voice was a fragile thread, swallowed almost immediately by the silence of the house. I hated how quiet it was. The house should have been filled with sound, scratching rats, the rustle of wind through broken windows, but there was nothing. Only the weight of things unsaid. I moved toward him, but he was gone. I was alone again. The stairs down to the basement called to me. It was an impulse, unreasoning, born of some dark compulsion. A thick, clammy sensation gripped my chest, tightening with every step. My flashlight flickered again, and the walls seemed to pulse, alive with an alien rhythm. The shadows on the walls flickering, wavering, seemed to shift unnaturally, elongating, twisting. At the bottom, the basement stretched before me, dark, too still. There was no sign of Carlos. The room was empty, except for a rickety table in the center, 2 candles perched upon it, their flames unnaturally bright, their flickers erratic and strange, casting long, crooked shadows on the walls that seemed to move of their own accord. I stood frozen, my breath caught in my throat, a cold sweat dripping down my back. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I was no longer sure that I had walked into this place willingly. And then I felt something behind me. The sensation of eyes staring into my back, cold, sharp eyes that pricked at the skin, that drew the warmth from my body. Slowly, as though guided by some unseen force, I turned. My heart stopped. There, standing at the top of the stairs, was Carlos. His face was pale, drawn, his eyes wide with something I couldn't place. "I didn't know there was a basement," he said, his voice strangely flat, hollow. A shiver ran through me. It wasn't him. It wasn't the Carlos I knew. This wasn't real. I barely had time to process the thought before a shuddering breath of cold air rushed past me, a whisper barely perceptible, but it felt like a finger tracing my spine. I whispered, my voice trembling, "Come down here." We descended into the dark together, the weight of the house pressing in from all sides. The shadows lengthened, curling into shapes, into things. The flickering candles bathed the room in a light that was wrong, a fevered kind of glow. We turned to leave, and that's when I saw it. A silhouette standing at the edge of the room, in the dark, in the place where the candlelight couldn't reach. It was tall, impossibly tall. It had no features, no distinguishing marks, only the faint impression of a shape, a form in the dark, something that wasn't quite human. I froze, my chest constricting with the weight of an impossible terror. It was watching us, waiting for us. The basement was smaller now, closing in around us. The very air seemed to recoil in fear. My breath caught in my throat. We ran. We bolted for the stairs, our feet pounding the creaking boards, the air thick with the scent of rot. I glanced back once, just before we reached the back door. The silhouette was gone, but the darkness it left behind lingered. It clung to us, like the shadow of something that had been chasing us, something that was still there, waiting. We stumbled outside, gasping for air as the cool night wrapped around us like a protective cloak. The house loomed behind us, silent now, save for the faint glow of the candles through the cracked windows. It was as though the house itself were beckoning, inviting us to return, daring us to come back. We drove away, the Parker house fading into the night, but its presence didn't leave. It lingered in the periphery, like a memory you couldn't fully shake. A presence that had followed us, one that waited for the next fool to cross its threshold. Weeks passed, but the house didn't fade. It lingered in my thoughts like an itch you couldn't scratch. The next Halloween, Carlos and I would laugh, recounting the night we almost turned into children, trembling in the face of something we didn't understand. But deep down, something darker lingered. We knew it. It hadn't left. I could feel the house still watching us, its hollow windows searching for us, waiting for the next unwitting soul to pass into its domain. I never went back. But sometimes in the stillness of night, I thought I heard the faint sound of a creak from the direction of the Parker house, as if it were waiting, patient for something or someone to return. Thank you for joining me for 3 disturbing true fall horror stories. As we journey through the chilling atmosphere of autumn, where the days grow shorter and the nights stretch long and dark, I hope these tales served as a reminder of the eerie mysteries that often lie hidden just beneath the surface of the season's beauty. Fall is not just about vibrant leaves and crisp air. It's also a time when the unknown feels just a little closer. And the shadows around us seem to carry secrets of their own. I want to express my deepest gratitude for your support. Whether you've been with this channel from the start or you're joining us for the first time, your encouragement, comments, likes, and shares mean more than I can say. It's because of you that I can continue exploring the dark corners of storytelling and bringing these unsettling tales to light. If you haven't already, don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you won't miss what's coming next. As you go about your days and nights, take a moment to appreciate the season, but also keep your senses sharp. Fall may seem peaceful, but as these stories have shown, there's often more to the quiet rustle of leaves or the distant sound of footsteps than meets the eye. Take care of yourselves, stay safe, and remember to trust your instincts when something feels off. I wish you all health, happiness, and perhaps just a touch of thrilling mystery to brighten or darken your autumn days. I'll see you in the next video. Until then, stay curious, stay cautious, and keep the lights on.